All right, I am thrilled to introduce most of the Tony Blankley Fellows from this year, from years past. You've had the opportunity to hear many of them speak on panels, and they are an impressive group. This is a wonderful opportunity to reward young people who are doing incredible work in the conservative space. And I have to say hats off to Jennifer and everyone at the Steamboat Institute for finding these people, first of all, and for awarding them so they can continue to do their work aggressively on the behalf of free market policies and conservative thinking. I'd like to welcome to the stage, I'd like to welcome to the Zoom screen Tom Rogan, Commentary Desk, Washington Examiner. He is, I believe, the first Blankley Fellow, if I'm not mistaken. We also have, coming up to the stage here, you heard Jillian K. Melcher, a couple panels yesterday, doing an outstanding job. She's an editorial page writer with the Wall Street Journal. We also have Hadley Heath Manning, another outstanding. You guys can go ahead and make your way to the stage. Yeah, just come on up. Hadley Heath Manning is now the policy director for the Independent Women's Forum. Kelsey Bolar is the senior news producer for the Daily Signal, an excellent news operation as well. We have via Zoom Philip Wegman, the White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics. Amber Athey will be making her way over from her panel. She is also a White House correspondent for the Daily Caller. Saagar Enjeti is the chief Washington correspondent for The Hill, and he'll be joining us via Zoom. And of course, Patrice Onwuka, who just got her Blankley Fellow, and her, where are your Oxfords, ladies? I'm a little disappointed that you're all not wearing tacky shoes. You look far too fashionable right now. But welcome all of these wonderful scholars, wonderful people who have truly exemplified what Tony Blankley was all about, and I'm going to allow them to talk to you a little bit about it. Amber has joined us now. Thank you. Amber's wearing her shoes, I'd like to point out. There you go.
Well, speaking of fashionable, you guys got really lucky with the draw this year. You got the fairer sex here with you in person, and our male colleagues are all joining us via Zoom. I thought, what a coincidence. But we've decided to sort of give some opening remarks in order of seniority. So we're going to start with Tom, and then after we all give some remarks, we hope you have some questions for us. So start thinking of those. Tom, are you with us?
I'm with you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Look at this modern technology. Well, it's great to be with everyone, even if remotely. I'll start off just talking a little bit about some of my thoughts on journalism. I mainly cover foreign policy, write for the Washington Examiner, and talking about the idea of journalism and objectivity. And as much as I can't compare with some of the auspicious members that have followed me in the Tony Blankley chair, one of the things I've found quite striking, especially this year, more relevant with COVID, but more broadly relevant, is the degree to which President Trump's record on China as really being to China what Truman was to the Soviet Union is not judged in any sense positively by the media. Either President Trump is jockeying for a war or he's a racist against China. And one of the challenges here, I think, to journalism in particular, is that the functional reality of communist China, whether it be the detention and persecution of Muslims in the northwest of the country, whether it be the imperial island strategy China is pursuing in the South China Sea, which really harkens back to what Imperial Japan did in the 1930s, whether it be the industrial intellectual property theft, whether it be COVID. There are so many examples in the cover up there. And it seems to me quite extraordinary that you don't find more open willingness in media to suggest actually President Trump, in taking a harsher line against China in each of these areas, including trade as well, perhaps has done something really important for the United States, not simply in the essence of this short-term factor, but in really what is a generational challenge beyond China. So that's something I find quite striking. In the foreign policy world, there's not a particular interest, I think, to face up to that reality. Although fortunately, I would say it is one area where conservatives, I think, regardless of our stripes on other issues, are pretty unified now in recognizing the core challenge of China. Beyond China, obviously interested in focusing on Iran, North Korea, Russia, all these different issues that pose challenges. But in each of them as well, I think there is an indication. We look at Iran, for example, the media very generally supportive or genuinely supportive of the Iran nuclear deal negotiated by President Obama. But you look at Iran's situation now with the effective collapse of its economy, the constraint of its foreign policy apparatus, especially the Revolutionary Guard Corps, in places like Lebanon, for example. It doesn't make the news, but Iran is greatly weakened. A lot of that comes down to President Trump's strategy with Iran. And I think the president also should give, some of the people here might be surprised to hear me say this, the president deserves credit for taking a balanced line in terms of perhaps being more moderate with Iran on issues where Iran, for example, shot down the US drone, then leaping to war. So there's quite nuanced strategy that's paying dividends. But maybe we'll get to some of that in the questions, but I will pass over to Hadley.
Thanks, Tom. By the miracle of technology. And the technology has worked pretty well for this conference, so I really appreciate all the hard work from our AV team and from the conference organizers. My remarks about journalism will be a little bit more, I guess, generic to journalism. I actually studied journalism in college. I went to the University of North Carolina. I think it has one of the best college journalism programs in the country. And to answer the question, is journalism broken? My answer is going to be yes. I think we might get unanimous consent on that. But I think if it's broken, it's been a long road to get there. It's not something that's happened relatively recently. When I was a college student, I had a professor who was teaching us the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. This is part of our curriculum. I think that's great. We should study a code of ethics if we're training as journalists. And one piece of that code of ethics is to seek the truth and report it. But my professor suggested that we should change this piece of the code of ethics to say, seek the truths and report them, so to make the truth plural. And since I come from a conservative Christian household, this immediately set off alarm bells with me about moral relativity and about relative truth, and I thought, this isn't right. There's just one truth. There's an absolute truth. And so you know what I did? The next day I marched into class and I gave my professor a sermon on tape about absolute truth. So you can imagine that I was a really popular college student, especially with my professors who didn't really share my political leanings. So I think that's kind of funny that it was a little naive of me maybe to start sharing sermons on tape with my professors in response to this. And if I'm giving a more charitable interpretation maybe to my professor's suggestion, I think what he was maybe trying to say is people have different perspectives. And we should try as journalists to include their different perspectives in the stories that we write. And I really shouldn't say we as journalists now, because I haven't pursued journalism. I do not call myself a journalist. I instead took the path of working in public policy, where I work for Independent Women's Forum. Now I am one of those perspectives. Now, as a commentator, I frequently comment to the media, whether that's on live television or to print reporters, or if it's in some sort of new cutting-edge media form. And that's my privilege to represent our perspective, and I'm very upfront about the fact that I am a conservative. I'm not trying to be a neutral party. I'm trying to advocate for a perspective, which I think is the right perspective, the conservative perspective, and my only hope is that I would be treated fairly. And in my experience, it doesn't always happen that way. And I'll tell you the thing that I'm most fearful of as a commentator are the recorded interviews and the print reporter interviews. I'll go on MSNBC Live anytime. I'm happy to do that. Throw me in the lion's den, yell at me, cut off my mic, that's fine. But please don't manipulate things that I said or try to talk me into saying something that's the worst possible talking point and use only that in your story. That's sort of my fear as someone who comments to the media. And I've experienced that every once in a while. And so that's one reason I believe journalism is broken, because I think if you're really a journalist, if you're really doing the work of seeking the truth and report it, you're trying to include the perspectives and you're trying to include the best of those perspectives. You're not agenda setting or intentionally trying to make one side look as if they have a different set of motives than what they really have in reality. So that's sort of my take on, is journalism broken? And with that, I guess we'll go next to Kelsey.
Yeah, well, thank you all for having us today. I'm very excited that Patrice is now one of our Tony Blankley Fellows. Beautiful speech last night. I think you had a couple of us in tears. As to the question for is journalism broken, I would second that yes. When I moved to Washington, D.C., I was really torn between going to one of the mainstream news organizations and being a true journalist where I would put my personal opinions aside. And luckily, I did stumble upon a place that enabled me to use my personal opinions for good in the journalism world. I started my career at the Daily Signal with the Heritage Foundation. And my role there was putting a face to the different policy issues that are impacting Americans. And of course, if you are a conservative American, the personal impact that these policies are having on your life and your livelihood are not represented in the mainstream media. Since in the last year, since becoming a mom, I actually made a career change that I credit a lot to the Steamboat Institute and introducing me to Hadley. I became a fellow with Independent Women's Forum shortly after becoming a fellow here. And after becoming a mom, I moved over to Independent Women's Forum because it is just about the most mom-friendly organization you could find. I think that is so important to recognize. I hope that if there are any silver linings from this COVID-19 pandemic, one of them is for companies and businesses to realize that remote work is possible. It is good for working moms, and had I not had the option to still engage and pursue my career, but also be home, IWF is fully remote, even without a global pandemic. If I hadn't had that option, I would have been tempted to step away from the workforce. And what a shame that would be, given all the resources I've been blessed with, and this is a perfect example. I know we just followed Molly Hemingway, who is perhaps the most important voice on the conservative side when it comes to media bias. She has been a friend and mentor to me. I'm very grateful for all these women who have enabled me to continue pursuing my career in this personal storytelling, and I'm very excited to be bringing that skill to Independent Women's Forum, where we are working to combat this media bias and put a face to a lot of the issues and the realities that our country faces today. We heard a lot about police, defund the police, that whole narrative. 81% of African Americans actually want more resources given to the police. They want more police in their communities. And just one example of what we're doing at Independent Women's Forum to try to combat that bias is to tell some of those stories of why African Americans actually want more police, not fewer police. So I feel very blessed for this career change this year. We are doing our small part to combat media bias, and for me personally, that means telling these personal stories, whether in written form or on video, of how policies are impacting real people back home. And on that front, I'll pass it off to, hopefully we have Phil.
Actually, we don't have Phil.
No?
No. I was going to remark on how Kelsey and Amber both changed jobs this year. And also, since last Freedom Conference, Kelsey gave birth and Patrice had a baby. And I don't know what the guys have been up to, but these guys have been doing. They
can't even get here.
Right. New jobs and new babies. But since Phil is not with us, now the twins are up. The 2019, Amber and Saagar. I'll let you decide, Amber, if you'd like to go first or kick to Saagar.
I'll go first.
Okay, Amber.
So one of the biggest problems that I found in journalism is there's this new school of thought coming from mainly left-wing and progressive journalists that it's no longer a journalist's job to present both sides. So how it used to be is if you were covering a story as a journalist, you would try to get a quote from maybe someone who works for a left-wing think tank, and then maybe you try to get a quote from a conservative, and the whole goal is to provide a balanced perspective on an issue. Well, now, what I hear a lot from people on the left, and even in mainstream journalistic institutions, is that both sidesism is wrong because only one side is accurate. So from their perspective, conservatism is wrong, and so it's actually a bad thing to present the conservative perspective in a story or in an article because you are then feeding untruths to the public. And you cannot overstate how dangerous this is, because all reporting is now done with the premise that the left-wing point of view is the correct one, and therefore that's the only point of view that is getting across to people who are reading the news. And as someone who's covered Congress and covered the White House, I've really seen firsthand that a lot of these reporters don't only not understand conservatism, but they don't really care to understand. They come at this with a bias in that they believe conservatism is filled with bad motives, as you touched on earlier, and therefore that their perspective is not worth understanding, not worth promoting, or not worth presenting to the American people. So that's one of the main problems in why journalism has become so biased, and why when you read even just a basic news story, it seems like it's automatically skewed to one side. And I will say there are some people who come from the older era of journalism, who work for places like the Washington Post and the New York Times, who do actually kind of attempt to do the right thing, but they are bullied into submission by these radical left-wing activists in the media and in their institutions, who get angry at them and revolt internally if they try to present the conservative perspective. I mean, look at the New York Times, for example. When they published that Tom Cotton op-ed where he suggested using federal troops to put down insurrection and riots, there was an outcry from New York Times staff who started tweeting that Tom Cotton's op-ed was actually putting their black colleagues in danger. So having an opinion was actually violence against them. And this is from sort of that woke college crowd that has recently graduated and has taken everything they've learned in these left-wing institutions, and now they're working in media, and they're able to bully and challenge people who have been working in the media for such a long time into submission, and get the opinion editors fired, or basically have strikes in their own offices. It's really a dangerous place for journalists to be working, because they are not able to practice the ethics that they were taught. And, there are some people who are fighting back. You have the Andrew Sullivans and the Barry Weisses and people who do speak out about it, but there's really not an incentive to do so, because if you do, you either are fired or you're canceled. You have to move to a Substack in order for people to read your work, and you really don't have a place anymore at any of the mainstream institutions. So really what's happening from my perspective is that we've taken the woke college protests. I think it was described last night as the woke spa by Heather McDonald. And those people are now, just as they're infiltrating, big tech companies and corporations, they're also infiltrating the media. And they are there to launch an insurrection against any semblance of balance in the media, any semblance of fairness. And so the problem is really only going to get worse unless people like us and people who work for these institutions are willing to stand up and say, no, that's not what journalism is supposed to be. We are going to present both sides. We're going to share the conservative perspective, and we're not going to cave to your bullying.
Saagar, are you
Okay,
there?
can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm very sorry that I was not able to be there today. Amber, I couldn't agree with you more. Maybe that's why we share we shared the award in 2019, because that's really very much along the lines of my answer, which is that, is journalism broken? Yes. And the reason why is not just because journalism is broken, it's because so much of our society is broken. Our institutions, media just reflects the same thing that's happening in corporate America all across this country, which is that they want to delegitimize your and I ability in order to freely express our views in the workplace. Let's say that we're even off the clock. Let's say we're at home and you tweet something, you put something on Facebook in your political positions. They want to make that a violation of your conduct within the workplace and exactly mimicking the language that Amber said there, putting people in danger. They want to weaponize their identities in order to delegitimize a view that is held by the majority of this country. And I used to be a lot more optimistic about it because I always knew that, there are normal folks like us who are out there and, we just want to live our lives and we want to be able to go about our business. But after the riots and the looting and the legitimization of outright arson and crime and destruction and murder, I really realized how much of a top-down war this is by some very select few, but who in my view were winning at least for a few months. Now, in recent days, I've actually seen that break just a little bit. And I think that what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin, finally broke through the dam through which these people realized that what they had justified and what they had essentially, ran PR for might actually lose them the election. But it's pretty disgusting that that's what it took, is that something had to happen in a battleground state before anybody began to even pay attention or even to admit some of the flaws in the things that they had justified. So I tie this all back to the university, and 5-10 years ago, they would say that you're an insane person for worrying about what's happening on college campuses. Those people graduated, and now they work at the New York Times, and now they work at the Washington Post or Vox or some of the most other culturally important positions in America. And it's only, this is why I think I want to end on one note of optimism, which is that the Times cannot claim to be the paper of record anymore. So neither can the Washington Post. Neither can any of these other so-called storied institutions of journalism. They've made their choice. They want to pander to liberals and then get their subscription fees up, and it's very lucrative in terms of their business. But they can't claim the mantle of objectivity that they once were able to. So that's a bad thing in the current moment because we don't have power in many of these other institutions. But it makes it so that we can do what we do best, which is create, which we can use the market incentive, because there are millions of us who are out there who actually want to hear the truth, or want to hear dissenting opinions, or maybe we just want to go about our lives and read a story which is at least somewhat fair to a perspective that's held by so many of us, our family, our friends, and our loved ones. So is journalism broken? Yes, but it can also be fixed. And that's something that I think all of us here are trying to do in our daily careers, and it's something that inspires me really about a program like this, bringing people together, making it known that there is a way to be elevated if you are willing to speak out and speak truth.
Great. So, I think I will offer one where I think it's broken and pick up on where Saagar left off in terms of a way forward, an optimistic way forward. So what I've noticed that a lot of journalists today want to be celebrities, and social media has made that possible. We see this when we watch the White House briefings, where you've got these journalists who want to stand up and get that gotcha question with the president, engage in back and forth with the leader of the country, not because they're searching for truth, the truth as Hadley talked about, or finding any sort of fact. It is to get their moment that they can clip and then show during the primetime television shows. And if you're like a lot of Americans, you come home from a long day's work, maybe you flip on ABC or CBS or whatever the local, or maybe the primetime show is, and you want to kind of catch up on what the headlines are, and you get that clip with that reporter combating the president, and really it's not about what they're even asking him, it's about them putting themselves on a pedestal and being that face for the voiceless. And then on social media, you see a lot of these personalities. They should be journalists, not commentators like myself. I'm a commentator, but journalists who are becoming commentators and use social media to rally the gang and the troops, putting out headlines. We call them clickbait headlines. They're some headline that says something crazy, maybe the administration has done X, Y, and Z, and then they're inflammatory. Most people only read the headlines and make up their decision or opinion based on what that headline is and run with it and share it. And that information forms an inaccurate view of the actual issue. But then when you click on the actual article and you read these, not even buried, sometimes it's just in the second paragraph where they actually deny or their facts that they present denies what their headline was. I mean, I called out, I think, a New York Times economics writer about something the way she presented some GDP numbers or gross domestic product numbers. And I'm like, your own article denies what you said in the headline. Now, nobody noticed my tweet, but I think it's incumbent on us when we see these falsehoods to call it out. Because these folks, a lot of them, they are trying to make a name for themselves. Maybe they want to have the book deal down the line, and instead of taking their journalistic duties seriously, instead of realizing that we as regular folks are looking to them to tell us what is the fact and what is going on at the national level and even at the local level, they're trying to, find some sort of financial or political goal in mind. So I think that's part of what's also broken right now. Now, how do we move forward? I'm very encouraged, and Saagar mentioned this, about citizen journalism. I think it has been tremendous to see the number of people who have a smartphone and suddenly are presenting or at least giving us accuracy and facts in real time. Or people who are dedicated to saying, at the local level, I am going to the school board meeting and I'm taking notes and then I'm going to report it to the local newspaper. Maybe they have an online blog where they're capturing what's going on that doesn't get into the local news. And I think it's important that we encourage citizen journalism. I love to follow those folks, but also those who are financially supported. That's actually an area where you can be donating some of your finances to small outlets that are budding, but they are local, because it's at the local level that some of the most sinister, ridiculous, inane policies are happening. And I'll just pivot to one more thing, which can be harmful or helpful when you look at what's happening with journalism. I think I raised that question about AB 5 on the first day. It's a law in California, the place where all the best laws come out of, right? Which is really just talking about getting rid of independent contractors and freelancers. The journalists have been hit. Freelance journalists suddenly, because of a very special provision in that California Democratic passed bill or law, they are suddenly seeing their work dry up. Why is that important? Because it's those citizen journalists, those folks who are in California. I know of one who we had on our podcast at the Independent Women's Forum. She said, without our voices holding those politicians accountable for the things that they're passing, no one would know about it and no one would be a check and balance on what they're doing. And so when we have laws that I guess are supposed to be pro-worker end up taking away the checks and balances in our system, that is another reason for us to be very on guard when we hear about stuff at the federal level that's meant to be pro-worker. But I am encouraged that citizen journalism is not dead and it's actually thriving, and provided there are no legislative laws that kind of undercut that work, I think those are going to be the folks that we can rely on, who are going to tell us the truth and get us the stories even when our local, national, and state-based newspapers are not able to, particularly because their newsrooms are being decimated and they're losing staff.
I have a couple of questions from the audience. First of all, I'd like to ask the question. Yes, thank you, Patrice. I didn't mean to step on your applause there. Sorry about that. Bernie Goldberg's book, Bias, came out in 2001. And if anything, bias in the media has gotten significantly worse. And as a member of the media, people often ask me, why don't these news organizations recognize their bias? Why are they so unwilling to consider that a lot of people believe they are biased might have a point? Because I have personally had conversations with newspaper editors, with television stations, and they simply say, we're not biased because everyone in the newsroom believes the same thing. So do you see that in your work? Do you see a resistance to even consider that they may have a problem? And is that something that has to be resolved before any real change can occur?
The liberal media bubble is a very, very real thing. These people who work at the elite journalism institutions, they all went to the top universities. They all went to Yale, to Harvard, to Oxford, and they all sort of were created and grew up in the same communities. A lot of them come from wealthy families that are more liberal, and they all coalesce together at a news organization and they're only hearing one opinion all the time. And anyone who has a dissenting opinion is outcast. They are bullied out of the media institution. And so these people view themselves as they're smarter than everybody else, they're better than everybody else, even just by nature of how they were born. They truly believe that they are the elites in society and that everyone else is just a stupid rube. I mean, and I'm not just saying this because it's my opinion, they will tell you that they believe this. I mean, there are reporters who are out on Twitter talking about how people in Florida are toothless, idiot Trump supporters. There are actual journalists from Politico who have tweeted that. You have people who go on cable news and mock Southern accents. They're not hiding what they believe. To them, they are the brightest and best of society, and anyone who disagrees with them is just dumb. That's truly what they believe. So from their perspective, why would they listen to the dumb Southerner who supports Trump when they know better than everybody else? And so it's really combating this attitude of elitism, and that's why the citizen journalists and the independent journalists and the conservative journalists are so important, because they are willing to listen to people who have different perspectives, even if it's a leftist, that we're willing to listen to them and hear their perspective, because we are ultimately anti-elitist. We believe in everyday Americans and the greatness of everyday Americans and the greatness of our country, and we don't sit here and think that we're above everyone else. We want to give everyone an equal voice. So one of the things that has been so great about the Blankley Fellowship is just the support it has given me and the other fellows to be able to provide a voice in media for people who have been ignored or even just outright mocked for so long.
Many of you have mentioned social media. And it's become increasingly difficult to deny that many, especially White House correspondents, are hard left. They're not center left. They are hard left, and they are very vocal on Twitter and other formats with their opinions. How can you have a news organization that doesn't try to curtail that? Because if I were the editor, I would say you're shutting down your Twitter feed right now, because it has completely blown any cover that they might have had, and I don't see that getting any better. Do you want to anyone want to weigh in on social media and the role that that's played in kind of demonstrating what journalism has become?
You know, I think social media plays a big part in our news consumption as well. You know, it tells us something about journalists, what they post on their own Twitter or Facebook pages, but I think so many people today are curating the news that they read from what their friends post on social media, and so that's another aspect to this. There are bubbles in journalism, but I think there's bubbles throughout our culture. I think we're seeing sort of the urban-rural divide, and we're seeing more, fewer civil institutions where people with different political perspectives can come together and understand one another. And so I think a piece of this, not to defend the media landscape today, but a piece of it is I think news consumers have some confirmation bias. They want to read news that confirms what they already thought. And part of the bias equation, too, is not just the reporting piece, because I think some of the liberal journalists that we're talking about might defend some of their reporting, and they might say, well, this was accurate about my reporting, or that was accurate about my reporting. But accurate reporting is only one piece of being non-biased. The other piece is the agenda-setting role of the press. What you choose to report on, what you choose not to report on. I think it's very telling, the obsession that some of our media outlets had, for example, with Brett Kavanaugh, but then you don't see a lot of reporting about Tara Reade. To me, that's a double standard.
I'd like to direct a question to one of the guys who couldn't make it here today. Tom, I've got a question for you, and it kind of goes to what Hadley just said. Recently, the UAE announced a huge breakthrough in their relationship with Israel. Had this been any other president, I believe that this would have been front page news because of the role of the Trump administration in helping facilitate a groundbreaking deal in the Middle East. Tom, why do you think that story came and went overnight? Is it just because it was Trump, or do we not care about Middle East peace anymore?
Well, I think it's a great question, and just quickly to give Phil Wegman a shout out. Obviously, he's not here. One of the things Phil is excellent at, as well as being an objective reporter, is being willing to push back against the bias. And when you sit with these people, and it's perhaps the most prominent area of media, it's easy to sort of kowtow and accept the narrative, but Phil pushes back to that. But in answer to your question, I think it's absolutely because it's President Trump. We look at the dichotomy in terms of how the Iran deal was assessed by the media, and based on the modus operandi of the Iranian state since at least 1979, not a great idea to cut a deal where they have a month warning for inspections. That's not a great way to have verified conduct. But in terms of the UAE and Israel, look, I think there are two issues here that the media doesn't like. Number one, it reflects successful brokering, leveraging the Israeli government, which is a coalition government, to make concessions to the Palestinians. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in the center right of the Israeli political state, as it were, annoyed a lot of people by saying that he would, in return for this deal, suspend the appropriation of areas of the West Bank into the Israeli state. That was only possible because the Trump administration has the trust and leverage with Israel that it does. In return, the UAE, feeling the consolidation to come to the table, to cut this deal in a very public way. And the importance here of the public sphere, people being willing to do things openly, even if there had been improving relations behind the scenes, again, is very important. And so, the simple answer to your question, yes, it is a major structural change. It reflects a growing trend on the part of the Sunni Arab monarchies to move towards Israel. But the Trump administration made it possible. And I just think in an election year where peace, something that supposedly we all should be behind, was so sort of disdainfully viewed by much of the media or ignored in large part, I think is a reflection of this broader bias. And the challenge becomes that in the election cycle, because of that November crunch date that so many journalists view as a moment of truth for the country, or selective truth, Orwellian truth maybe, they are unwilling to throw a bone. But I think there is a fortunate element here, though, with foreign governments who perhaps took a while to get to understand the Trump administration, perhaps as much as you can understand President Trump in terms of his approach to governing. And they look at things like this and say, you know what, that's really good news. Obama didn't do that, Trump did that. And so it gives this sense, maybe for a second Trump term, and we think about China, for example, the ability to leverage successes in foreign policy to persuade other partners to join with you. If President Trump is re-elected, I think we'll see some really interesting things happen, for example, with Vietnam in terms of alliance against China. And so, as much as the media doesn't cover it, the success in the nuts and bolts physical reality will speak for itself ultimately, I think.
I'm sure he's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, as Obama did as well. I wait for that. Saagar, I'd like to ask you a question about how President Trump has, I believe, manipulated the news media in Washington, D.C. I have watched this now with great frustration on occasion, where the president would have a great accomplishment and then immediately say something ridiculous that the press seized on as a way of almost giving them an out to prevent them from covering whatever just happened. It's very frustrating. A listener of mine said, just when the press runs out of ammunition, President Trump walks in with a tray full of bullets. But I also think there's kind of a genius in that, because it's allowed a lot of stuff to happen behind the scenes that isn't being talked about. This UAE deal appeared to come out of nowhere. That should have been a big story. Do you think that the president manipulates the media to keep them talking about things that don't matter while he goes about the business of the American people?
I absolutely think that that's part of the strategy. When I was a White House correspondent for the Daily Caller, one of the most revealing things that Trump ever did was, it was a press conference in November, right after the midterm elections. And one of the reporters was like, "Mr. President, thank you for doing this press conference." And he's like, "What, you think I do this for free? It's called earned media. It's worth billions." And I remember that very distinctly. He knows exactly what he's doing whenever it comes to many of these things. I've had the opportunity, I think, to interview him 4 separate times, and I've asked him many different times about media and how exactly he consumes it. He's a very adept watcher and listener, and he watches exactly what's happening with the news. His tweets are very much, in most of the ways, they're timed in order to try and influence things in a different direction. But he's also a person of pure id. And so in some ways, I think he has damaged his administration by occasionally, he'll say something which will detract from something which is happening. But in many other ways, he'll use his kind of bombastic personality in order to have a media focusing on that. Because at the end of the day, the more that they focus on tweets, the more that they focus on personality, the more that they focus on things which most Americans can see are absolutely ridiculous, it ultimately helps him. You can go and you can look at the polling. I mean, the things that they carp on, Russiagate, impeachment, I mean, where those rank in the importance of Americans relative to economic changes or substantive issues is dramatic. I mean, we're talking, impeachment is 13. I mean, I don't even think the Democrats mentioned it at their convention. That's how much of a disaster it was for them. But you can think about how much the media covered that story relative to what's actually important in people's lives, things like immigration and many others. So Trump is the master of this in many ways. I think it's been a mixed bag in terms of how he can conduct himself on occasion. But overall, I'd say it's a net positive for him.
One last question as we're running out of time, and I'm sure that you can all answer this question. Everybody wants to know if you've appeared on a liberal news program and what that's like, how you are treated when you go on MSNBC or CNN. What is that experience like? Patrice?
Yes. The hosts come against you. The guests, the other panelists jump on top of you. But the worst is when you come home and then your phone blows up because everyone on social media has called you everything under the book. And as a black female immigrant conservative and every other thing you can imagine, I get called. Coon is really generous. Uncle Tom is really generous. I've had people offer to rape me. I mean, crazy stuff as a result. And all because, not because and people will, if you watch me, I'm actually really, I'm not one of those in-your-face type of person. I will get my point across to you. I will end with a little smize with my eye, so you know that I just cut you down. But I'm going to do it in a very respectful way. But the way I get treated afterwards is always the worst. So, it's like you're taking bullets, and I'm just going to end on the analogy of in Wonder Woman during the World War I or World War II scene. She's taking the bullets from the enemy camp while the rest of the soldiers can come behind you. So I'm willing to take the bullets.
Thank you to all of our Tony Blankley scholars. It is fantastic to see the next generation of great people that are going to carry this message forward. I go to a lot of policy events, and it's a lot of gray-haired people on the stages. So it's nice to see people who are going to be around and fighting this fight for a long time. So thank you all, and congratulations to all of you.
Thank you.